Samuel Moyn's The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, 2010, presents a revisionist interpretation of the history of human rights, challenging the commonly accepted narrative that links modern human rights to the Enlightenment, the American and French revolutions, or even post-World War II international agreements. Instead, Moyn argues that human rights, as we understand them today, emerged in the 1970s as a response to the failure of other utopian projects, particularly socialism, anti-colonialism, and political revolution. His work critically assesses the development of human rights discourse, exposing the discontinuities and ideological shifts that shaped their rise to prominence. Moyn insists that human rights should not be seen as a timeless moral ideal, but rather as a historically contingent phenomenon that gained traction when other visions of global justice faltered. The central argument: a late emergence of human rights. Moyn's thesis challenges the traditional view that human rights are deeply rooted in Western intellectual and political traditions. Many scholars have traced the origins of human rights to early philosophical and religious traditions, the declarations of the late 18th century, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, of 1948. However, Moyn dismisses these connections, arguing that they represent retrospective projections rather than actual historical developments. Instead, he claims that modern human rights only became a major political force in the 1970s, when older utopian ideals, such as revolutionary socialism and nationalist liberation movements, lost credibility. Human rights, in his view, became the last utopia, a final idealistic vision of justice that replaced failed grand narratives. Debunking the myth of 1948 as a watershed moment. One of Moyn's most provocative claims is that the UDHR of 1948 was not nearly as influential as is commonly assumed. Many scholars and activists treat the UDHR as the birth certificate of modern human rights, arguing that it laid the foundation for the post-war order. However, Moyn challenges this assumption by demonstrating that the declaration was largely symbolic at the time of its adoption. The Cold War soon overshadowed the UDHR, and neither the United States nor the Soviet Union prioritized human rights in their foreign policies. The 1950s and 1960s were dominated by superpower competition, decolonization struggles, and ideological battles between capitalism and communism. The global discourse of human rights remained marginal, largely ignored in favor of national self-determination, development, and revolutionary struggles. Moyn's argument undermines the idea that the post-1945 era marked a new commitment to human rights. He suggests that historians and policymakers have exaggerated the importance of 1948, retroactively inserting human rights into a period when they had little real impact. The 1970s, the real birth of human rights. According to Moyn, the real turning point for human rights occurred in the 1970s, not immediately after World War II. This period saw the decline of alternative utopian visions, including Marxist-inspired revolutionary movements, the optimism of post-colonial nationalism, and even some elements of liberal internationalism. As these ideologies collapsed or lost credibility, human rights emerged as a substitute moral framework for those seeking justice without the revolutionary fervor of previous decades. Moyn points to key moments in the 1970s that helped catapult human rights to the center of global politics. The Helsinki Accords, 1975, a major Cold War agreement that emphasized human rights as a legitimate subject of international concern. The rise of Amnesty International, founded in 1961, it gained prominence in the 1970s as a global movement dedicated to exposing human rights abuses. U.S. foreign policy under Jimmy Carter. Carter's administration, 1977 to 1981, promoted human rights as a key element of American foreign policy, further elevating the concept. This decade saw the shift from rights as a secondary concern to a dominant framework for international moral and political activism. Crucially, the new human rights movement was not focused on economic or social justice, as socialism had been, but rather on individual political freedoms and protection from state violence. Human rights as a minimalist project. Moyn's analysis highlights the contrast between human rights and earlier utopian projects. Revolutionary socialism, for example, sought to create an entirely new social order based on economic equality and collective ownership. Anti-colonial movements aimed at complete national liberation and self-determination. Human rights, by contrast, took a more modest approach, advocating for the protection of individuals from oppression rather than proposing radical societal transformation. This minimalism, according to Moyn, is what made human rights so successful. Unlike socialism or nationalism, human rights were not tied to a particular state, ideology, or economic system. Instead, they offered a universal moral language that could be applied anywhere, appealing to diverse political actors. However, this minimalist nature also meant that human rights lacked a clear program for structural economic or political change. While they condemned human rights violations, they did not necessarily challenge the deeper inequalities that led to those violations. This, Moyn argues, made human rights attractive to Western governments, particularly the United States, which could use human rights rhetoric selectively without threatening the global economic order. Criticisms of Moyn's approach. Moyn's argument has generated significant debate. Some historians and legal scholars have criticized his thesis for downplaying the importance of earlier human rights traditions. Critics argue that human rights have deeper roots than Moyn acknowledges, pointing to figures such as Thomas Paine, the abolitionist movement, and the long struggle for civil rights. Others contend that the UDHR and post-World War II human rights treaties played a more substantial role than Moyn admits. While human rights may not have been politically dominant in the 1950s and 1960s, they were still an important part of international legal development, laying the groundwork for later activism. Additionally, some scholars argue that Moyn overstates the 1970s as a rupture point. While it is true that human rights gained new prominence in this period, earlier moments, including the Nuremberg trials, the founding of the United Nations, and the decolonization process, also contributed to the modern human rights movement. Despite these criticisms, Moyn's work has been widely praised for challenging conventional wisdom and prompting new discussions about the history of human rights. His emphasis on discontinuities and ideological shifts forces scholars to rethink simplistic narratives of progress. Implications for contemporary human rights. Moyn's reinterpretation of human rights history has important implications for today's global politics. If human rights are a relatively recent phenomenon, rather than an age-old moral principle, then their continued dominance is not guaranteed. Just as earlier utopian visions collapsed, human rights too could decline or be replaced by new frameworks. This raises questions about the future of human rights in an era of rising authoritarianism, nationalism, and economic inequality. If human rights emerged in response to the failure of socialism and decolonization, what happens if new political ideologies take their place? Are human rights strong enough to endure, or will they be superseded by alternative conceptions of justice? Moyn also challenges human rights advocates to rethink their strategies. If human rights have historically been a minimalist project, should they be expanded to include broader economic and social justice concerns? Or would that risk diluting their effectiveness? These are crucial questions for activists and policymakers alike. Samuel Moyn's The Last Utopia offers a provocative and revisionist account of human rights history, arguing that they did not originate in the Enlightenment or even in the aftermath of World War II, but instead emerged in the 1970s as a response to the failure of other utopian movements. By reframing human rights as a historically contingent development rather than a timeless moral ideal, Moyn challenges conventional narratives and forces readers to reconsider the foundations of modern human rights discourse. His work has sparked intense debate, with some scholars questioning his dismissal of earlier rights traditions and others embracing his insights about the shifting nature of political ideals. Regardless of one's position, The Last Utopia remains an essential contribution to the study of human rights, offering a critical perspective that deepens our understanding of their historical evolution and contemporary challenges. Let me know if you need any further assistance.